In 2018, a single LiDAR survey flight over northern Guatemala revealed what ground teams had spent a century failing to find. And what you are about to see across 10 sites will force a complete rethink of how large, how connected, and how old the ancient world really was. Beneath forests on 5 continents, LiDAR pulses have been stripping away the canopy digitally to expose road networks, irrigated farmland, and monumental architecture that mainstream maps still show as empty wilderness. The question that no one in the field has yet answered is not whether these hidden worlds existed. The scans are unambiguous, but how many more are still out there undiscovered, waiting beneath the trees? All right, let's go. Number 10. Caracol revealed, and nothing here is what it seemed. 177 square kilometers of ancient Maya urban landscape lay hidden beneath the jungle canopy of Belize, invisible to every ground survey that came before. The mystery was not that the city had vanished. The mystery was that it had been there all along, and 25 years of machete work had barely touched it. Somewhere beneath another forest, a laser map is already revealing a network that dwarfs even this. The Pacunam survey found something that changes the arithmetic of the ancient Maya world entirely. And a mountain plateau in Cambodia still holds a city whose true footprint mainstream maps refused to accept until recently. In 2010, archaeologists Arlen Chase and Diane Chase arranged for a LiDAR-equipped aircraft to fly a systematic grid over the rainforest canopy above Caracol in western Belize. They had spent 25 years on the ground at that site with teams, machetes, and hand-drawn maps, piecing together a picture of one of the most powerful Maya cities of the classic period. The aircraft took days. The result made those decades feel like a first draft. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, works by firing laser pulses downward from a low-flying aircraft, sometimes at rates approaching 400,000 pulses per second in survey-grade systems. The pulses that slip between leaves and branches strike the ground and return to the sensor. Software then strips the canopy away digitally, leaving only what the Earth itself holds. NASA had developed the technology through the 2000s, and by 2010, its archaeological applications were just beginning to be understood. What the Chases saw when the Caracol data resolved on screen was not a city they half recognized. It was an organism. Terraced agricultural hillsides, wide stone causeways linking outlying residential clusters to the civic core, low platforms extending into areas the ground teams had marked as empty forest. The full mapped extent came to approximately 177 square kilometers of continuous, organized urban landscape. That number is not a small revision to what was known. It is a different city. The textbook understanding of Maya urbanism before 2010 held that classic Maya centers were relatively compact, with dense monumental cores and thin, scattered populations beyond the central plazas. Caracol had already challenged that model through ground survey, but the scale of the challenge was limited by how much ground 2 researchers and their students could physically cover in a season. The established picture was incomplete in ways no one could fully measure, because the tool to measure it did not yet exist in the field. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Skeptics have argued that LiDAR only confirms what ground archaeologists already suspected, that it adds resolution rather than revelation, sharpening a picture that careful fieldwork had already sketched. The Caracol survey directly contradicts that claim. Structures confirmed in the LiDAR data sat in areas the ground teams had not reached after 25 years of sustained effort, and the causeways connecting outlying zones were largely unknown before the overflight. This was not higher resolution. This was new information, delivered in days from terrain that boots on the ground work had not penetrated in a quarter century. This means the scale of what archaeology has been missing is not a matter of a few overlooked ruins. It is a matter of entire urban systems whose existence was structurally invisible to the methods used to find them. Arlen and Diane Chase's survey demonstrated that LiDAR could collapse decades of field time into a single operational window. and that finding has since reshaped how survey projects are planned and funded across the Maya lowlands and beyond. There is one point that requires honest framing here. The LiDAR data identifies ground-level features with high confidence, but interpreting the function and population density of those features still depends on ground truthing, and some density estimates for Karakol and comparable sites remain actively debated among researchers. What makes this particularly haunting is that local Quechua Maya communities living near Karakol had maintained oral traditions describing ancient roads and sacred structures running through the forest long before any aircraft flew over it. The laser confirmed what memory had preserved. The causeways are still there beneath the canopy, stone under soil, older than any map that claimed to know where they were not. The full meaning of their reach, how many people moved along them, what they carried, what held the system together, is still unresolved. A civilization built at that scale did not think in the terms archaeology once assigned to it. Somewhere over the northern Maya lowlands, a different survey captured a number so large it forced researchers to reconsider every population estimate ever published for the ancient Maya world. Number 9. Karakol at peak, where a jungle hid a city entire. The mystery was simple and vast. Could a metropolis of more than 100,000 people vanish beneath a canopy so thoroughly that the ground told almost nothing? In 2016, archaeologists Arlen Chase and Diane Chase, alongside their colleagues, directed a LiDAR survey aircraft over the jungle-covered ruins of Karakol in western Belize, scanning the canopy floor with pulses of laser light. They were not expecting to redraw the map. They redrew it completely. The instrument stripped the forest away digitally. What appeared beneath was not a modest ceremonial center surrounded by scattered homesteads, which had been the working assumption for decades. The survey revealed 11 previously unrecorded causeways radiating outward from the city core, each one a raised stone road cutting through terrain that fieldwork on foot had classified as undisturbed jungle. That same survey produced the population figure that stilled the room. Karakol, at its peak during the classic Maya period, roughly between 650 and 800 CE, sustained a population estimated at around 115,000 people. That number did not come from a single monument or a burial count. It came from the sheer density of platforms, terraces, and rooftops the laser found pressed against one another across the landscape. The physical scale demands a moment of stillness. 115,000 people living and farming and moving goods through 11 mapped road corridors in a city that ground-level archaeology had persistently underestimated because the forest refused to yield its geometry to a researcher walking through it. Before that survey, the textbook position placed classic Maya cities as impressive but dispersed settlements, agricultural villages clustering around ceremonial cores, nothing approaching the continuous urban fabric of contemporary Old World cities of equivalent date. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The same 2016 LiDAR data, covering the broader southern Maya lowlands under Arlen Chase's direction, detected more than 76,000 individual agricultural terraces cut into hillsides and valley floors across the surveyed region. 76,000. Each terrace was a deliberate engineering project, retaining soil, directing water, and multiplying the productive area of land that from above had looked like unbroken forest. The food system implied by that number was not a subsistence patchwork. It was an industrial agricultural apparatus capable of feeding populations far denser than any model published before the laser arrived. This means the dispersed village interpretation was not merely modest. It was structurally wrong, shaped by the limits of what researchers could see from the ground rather than by the actual evidence of what the Maya had built. Mainstream archaeologists now broadly accept the Karakol population and causeway data, though some debate continues over precisely how simultaneous peak occupation of all mapped platforms was, and how the 115,000 figure was extrapolated from platform counts, a point of genuine methodological discussion rather than settled consensus. What the data does not dispute is the terracing. Chase's survey made clear that nearly every hilltop in the areas covered was not a natural feature. The Maya had modified them, shaped them, built on them. The landscape that looked primeval was, in many places, a constructed artifact. William Saturno had seen a related pattern as early as 2010 when LiDAR work around San Bartolo in Guatemala revealed dense continuous settlement across terrain that prior survey had recorded as empty jungle, showing that Caracol was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a civilizational pattern hiding in plain sight beneath the canopy. The truly unsettling aspect is that the definition of city which archaeology inherited from the cities already above ground turned out to be a definition built from absences rather than evidence. The cities researchers could not see were not smaller than the ones they could. Some were larger. Caracol is still there in the Belizean jungle, its causeways mapped but largely unexcavated. Its 115,000 lives still compressed into platform counts and laser returns that have yet to be fully read. The forest has given back the shape. It has not given back the meaning. And the question of how many other cities of comparable scale remain beneath surveyed terrain, unrecognized, is still without an answer that anyone can confidently give. Somewhere beneath a different canopy, on a different continent, a single submerged structure carries dimensions so improbable that its discoverers initially refused to report what they had measured. Number 8. Aguada Phoenix, where the jungle hid an impossible answer. The mystery was not that the structure existed. The mystery was what its existence meant about who had the power to build it. In 2020, archaeologist Takeshi Inomata was conducting a LiDAR survey over the Usumacinta River region of Tabasco, Mexico, when the laser returns began drawing something extraordinary out of the forest floor. The canopy dissolved in the data. What emerged beneath it was not a temple, not a pyramid, not a palace. It was a plateau. The central platform at Aguada Phoenix measures approximately 1,413 meters long and 399 meters wide, making it by total volume the largest ancient construction yet identified in the entire Maya and Olmec world. That number deserves a moment. 1,413 meters, longer than 12 football pitches laid end to end. The structure sits low and broad rather than soaring into the sky, its sheer ground coverage more startling than any tower could be. A statement made not in height but in mass, in collective human effort pressed into earth across generations of coordinated labor. Dating places the construction at around 1000 BCE, predating the classic Maya period, by nearly a full millennium, meaning this was not a late flourishing of a mature civilization. It was the beginning of something scholars had not anticipated finding at this scale or this early. The textbook account had long held that monumental construction of this order required a certain social engine: kings, priests with coercive authority, a ruling class capable of commanding labor through fear or religious obligation enforced from above. Mesoamerican archaeology had built much of its interpretive framework on exactly this assumption. Grand architecture and rigid hierarchy arriving together, inseparable, each one producing the other. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. At Aguada Phoenix, the archaeological record carries no convincing signature of centralized elite authority at the time of construction. No royal tombs of the period, no portraits of rulers, no inscriptions naming a king or a lineage. The site was built around 1000 BCE by a population that shows, in the available evidence, something closer to a broadly shared social organization than a pyramid of command. This is the precise reversal the site demands. The largest structure in the Maya-Olmec world was not raised by a king's decree. It was raised by people. This means the intellectual architecture built around hierarchy and monument must be re-examined. Some researchers argue the absence of elite markers reflects an early egalitarian or community-based form of organization, though mainstream archaeologists note that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. and this interpretation remains genuinely controversial and actively debated in the field. What the LiDAR data does confirm plainly is the physical scale and the early date. And what that physical scale at that early date confirms is that organized human ambition at the monumental level does not wait for kings to invent it. It precedes them. The capacity existed in the population before the hierarchy did, or perhaps instead of it entirely. A further LiDAR study in 2022, again led by Inomata, extended the picture across the Olmec heartland through Tabasco and Veracruz, and revealed at least 9 formally planned ceremonial complexes sharing a standard orientation of 8 degrees west of north. 9 sites, same angle, spread across hundreds of kilometers of territory. A shared cosmological blueprint, deliberately reproduced, implying that the communities building these complexes were in communication, in agreement, perhaps in something that deserves the word civilization, even if it looked nothing like the civilizations archaeologists were trained to recognize. The truly unsettling aspect is that none of this was visible until a laser beam swept through a canopy that had been overgrown for 3,000 years. And the question becomes not only what else lies beneath unscanned forest, but how many other assumptions about human social capacity were buried alongside the Earth. Aguada Phoenix is still there beneath the Tabasco sky, its plateau still holding the shape of a shared intention that predates every classic Maya king by centuries. What the people who built it believed about the cosmos, about one another, and about the act of building is still unresolved. Somewhere off the coast of a Japanese island, divers in the 1980s found a submerged stone formation with right angles precise enough that the argument over whether human hands made it has never fully closed. Number 7. The Pacunam Network, and the jungle hid everything. In 2016, researchers with the Pacunam LiDAR initiative fitted a small aircraft with a laser pulse instrument and flew it in careful grids over the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Petén, northern Guatemala. The instrument fired millions of laser pulses downward through the forest canopy every second. The trees, for the first time, became irrelevant. What came back was not a rough outline. The data resolved into walls, plazas, platforms, roads, and reservoirs, structure after structure materializing from what had looked, from the ground, like unbroken jungle. The survey covered 2,100 square kilometers. Within that area, the Pacunam team identified more than 60,000 previously undetected Maya structures. 60,000 in days. The physical scale of the find is difficult to absorb. Some structures were modest, low residential platforms, the kind a single extended family might have occupied for generations. Others were monumental. The ancient city of El Mirador, already known to archaeologists as significant, emerged from the LiDAR data as the hub of a causeway network, connecting it to at least 10 other cities, a political web of stone roads invisible from the surface and invisible from the air without the instrument to read it. The raised causeways, called Sacbeob in Maya tradition, ran up to 40 meters wide, broader than many modern highways, and Quanjob al-oral histories in the Petén region had preserved stories of exactly these elevated roads for generations before any laser confirmed them. The textbook reading, before 2016, allowed for impressive Maya cities Tikal, Palenque, Copan, as islands of monumental achievement separated by thinly populated forest. Population estimates were accordingly modest. The lowland classic Maya were understood as numerous, certainly, but not as a civilization that had reorganized an entire landscape at continental scale. And this is where the timeline stops making sense. The Pacunam data, taken together, suggests a classic Maya lowland population of somewhere between 10 and 15 million people, a figure that repositions the Maya world not as a collection of remarkable but isolated centers, but as one of the most densely inhabited regions on Earth during its peak centuries. Interconnected cities, raised highways stitching the landscape together across kilometers of what appeared to be empty forest, defensive fortifications ringing settlements that no one had catalogued, the infrastructure of an integrated civilization, not a scattered one. This reframing carries a caveat worth stating plainly. The population estimate of 10 to 15 million remains a projection drawn from structural density, and some researchers argue the LiDAR counts include agricultural terracing and water management features that inflate the residential figures, while others maintain the estimate is conservative. Mainstream archaeology broadly accepts the discovery as transformative, but continues to debate the precise population ceiling. What is not disputed is the sheer count of structures, or the sophistication of the causeway network, or the implication that ground-level archaeology had missed the majority of what was actually there. This means that decades of fieldwork, careful, serious, professional, had produced an incomplete picture simply because the instrument to see the full picture did not yet exist. Scale is only invisible when the tools to measure it are absent. An entire civilization had been hiding in the canopy, not through concealment, but through the ordinary limitations of human sight. What makes this particularly haunting is the Kwanjobal oral tradition. The stories of great elevated roads had survived in living memory in the Peten region, passed down through generations who could not see the causeways beneath the vegetation any more than the archaeologists could. The knowledge persisted in language while the physical evidence vanished under centuries of growth. The LiDAR did not discover something new so much as confirm something that had never been entirely forgotten. The Maya Biosphere Reserve is still there, and the 60,000 structures are still mapped in the Pacunam archive, waiting for the ground teams that have so far reached only a fraction of them. What remains unresolved is not the count, but the meaning, the full shape of the political world those causeways connected, and what it cost to build it. Somewhere beneath that same jungle floor, archaeologists have begun recovering the bones and tools of the laborers who raised every one of those 40-meter roads. And what those remains say about the people who did the work does not match the monuments built above them. Number 6, Maya Causeways, and the laser that proved the legends true. The mystery was not that the roads existed. Indigenous communities across the Yucatan and Petén had described raised stone highways threading through the jungle for generations, passed down in oral tradition long before any university expedition arrived with a theodolite and a notebook. Archaeologists had walked the region for over a century. They had mapped temples, catalogued stelae, and argued over dynastic succession in exhaustive detail. The roads, for the most part, were noted as local lore. Intriguing, perhaps. Not quite evidence. Then came the lasers. In 2021, archaeologist Marcello Canuto and colleagues working with the Pacunam LiDAR dataset published findings that reframed the entire conversation about Maya infrastructure. Flying sensors stripped away the forest canopy and data, pulse by pulse, and what appeared beneath was a road network of at least 110 kilometers of elevated causeways in the central Petén region of Guatemala alone. 110 kilometers. Not paths worn by foot traffic. Raised, engineered highways, some of them elevated several meters above the forest floor, built to move people, goods, and very likely armies between cities that had previously appeared isolated in the archaeological record. That same year, a separate LiDAR survey over the ancient city of Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico, led by Rodrigo Liendo Stuardo, revealed something the monumental core had always obscured. Suburban neighborhoods and terraced farmland, extending kilometers beyond the known ceremonial center, suggesting a populated urban landscape far denser and more organized than anyone had mapped on the ground. The standard picture before this was of Maya cities as ceremonial hubs surrounded by dispersed rural settlements, connected loosely by trade routes rather than engineered infrastructure. Complexity, yes, but the kind of complexity that could be kept within manageable numbers and manageable maps. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The Pakunam data did not reveal a few roads linking a few cities. It revealed a system, deliberate, coordinated, and implying a level of centralized planning across the Peten that the existing dynastic model could not fully account for. These causeways required organized labor at regional scale, sustained over decades across political boundaries that archaeologists had assumed were mostly hostile. This means that either the political landscape of the classic Maya was far more cooperative than the war monuments suggest, or the authority capable of commissioning those roads was more extensive and more coercive than the textbook timeline allowed. Neither option fits neatly into what was taught. It is worth noting that while the LiDAR data is accepted by mainstream researchers as accurate, some interpretations of the political organization implied by the network remain debated. The causeways confirm connectivity, but what kind of authority built and maintained them is still a live argument among Maya scholars. What is not debated is the scale. The comparison point matters here. A road network of this length and engineering precision, buried under jungle in a region archaeologists had studied intensively for generations, was not found by excavation. It was found because oral tradition had always pointed toward it, and the instrument finally sensitive enough to confirm it arrived in 2021. The Sambor-Prey-Cook parallel deserves mention. In 2019, LiDAR surveys over forest in Cambodia, near Sambor-Prey-Cook, revealed an urban plan consistent with the ancient pre-Angkorian Chenla capital, its octagonal city layout unique in Southeast Asian archaeology. Encircled by multiple moats covering several square kilometers, precisely matching descriptions in 7th century Chinese traveler records that historians had treated with polite skepticism for decades. 2 continents, the same pattern. Local memory preserved what excavation had missed, and a laser confirmed what the written record already contained. The truly unsettling aspect is not that the causeways were hidden. It is that they were never hidden to the people who lived there. The oral traditions were specific, consistent, and geographically accurate. The academic framework simply lacked the tools, and some researchers argue, the willingness to treat indigenous knowledge as primary evidence rather than colorful background material. The elevated roads of the Peten are still there beneath the canopy, still holding their geometry after more than 1,000 years. The stones do not require belief. What remains unresolved is the scale of what else is waiting in the data. How many more kilometers of causeways? How many more suburban districts? How many more oral traditions are sitting in the archive, already answered, waiting only for the instrument that takes them seriously? Somewhere off the coast of Japan, at a depth of 27 meters, a structure of stepped stone terraces and sharp right angles has been sitting on the seafloor since long before any accepted civilization was supposed to exist there. Number 5. Angkor's true scale, and the forest had been lying. Angkor was already the most studied temple complex in Southeast Asia. Scholars had mapped it by hand, by satellite, and by foot patrol for generations. The mystery was not whether Angkor was large. The mystery was whether anyone truly understood what large meant. In 2013, University of Sydney archaeologist Damien Evans flew a LiDAR instrument over the forests of Angkor, Cambodia, stripping away the canopy and pulses of laser light to read the ground beneath. He was running a systematic aerial survey when the returns came back, and the picture no longer matched any map that had come before it. What the data showed was not a temple surrounded by a city. It was a city the size of a modern metropolis, an urban sprawl exceeding 1,000 square kilometers of streets, pools, embankments, and residential grids buried under 8 centuries of jungle growth. 1,000 square kilometers. That number landed like a dropped stone. The textbook version of Angkor described a ceremonial center at its peak, perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, remarkable for its era but still legible within the frame of ancient settlements that had come before it. Scholars had long acknowledged the great reservoirs, the stone causeways, the temple mountains. The scale was impressive. It was not, as far as anyone had argued, categorically unprecedented in its organization. The written records were treated as poetic amplification. Khmer inscriptions and the oral accounts of local Cambodian monks had described a vast water management network for centuries before Evans arrived, but those descriptions had been received as tradition rather than technical specification. They were vivid. They were not taken as engineering blueprints, but here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The LiDAR did not merely confirm the temple precincts already known. It revealed over 1,000 kilometers of channels, canals, reservoirs, and embankments woven across the landscape in an intricate and deliberate grid. A hydraulic network managing seasonal flood pulses with an engineering complexity that researchers now believe had no close parallel anywhere in the pre-industrial world at the time of its construction. This was not ceremonial water. This was infrastructure at continental scale. The monks had been describing an engineering reality, precisely and for centuries, and no one had fully believed them. Critics note that Angkor's size may reflect ritual landscape engineering rather than dense habitation, inflating the urban figures. That objection is worth holding. The question of how many people actually lived within those mapped boundaries remains genuinely contested, and mainstream archaeologists dispute the highest population estimates. What is not disputed is the physical scale of the engineering itself. The channels exist. The embankments exist. The grid is real, and it is enormous, and it was built by human hands in a period when that kind of coordinated hydraulic planning was not supposed to exist outside the ancient Near East. This means that the largest pre-industrial city on Earth was already known to historians, and historians still got it wrong by an order of magnitude. It means that fame is not the same as understanding that a site can be studied, excavated, and celebrated for a century, while its true dimensions sit invisible beneath the trees. The same survey identified a planned urban grid at Preah Khan of Kampong Svai, a Khmer city covering approximately 55 square kilometers outside Angkor itself, structured and deliberate and almost entirely unexamined, a major city hiding in plain sight beside the most famous city in the region. What makes this particularly haunting is the implication that runs beneath every laser return from that 2013 survey. If this is what was missed at Angkor, the site with more scholarly attention than almost any other in Southeast Asia, then the question of what remains unmapped beneath the world's other forest canopies becomes not romantic speculation, but a straightforward matter of instrument access. The jungle above Angkor is still there, still reclaiming the stones at its edges. The hydraulic grid is still embedded in the earth, most of its channels unexcavated. Most of its engineering logic still being worked out from the air. Damian Evans's dataset is still being processed, still yielding details that shift the boundaries of what was previously recorded. The city was always this large. It simply waited for a technology honest enough to say so. Elsewhere, in a place with no jungle cover and no temple spires to draw the eye, a different kind of scale problem sits in plain sight, a single wall of fitted stone, 900 kilometers long, whose builders left no inscription, no name, and no explanation for why it needed to exist at all. Number 4. Mahendra Parvata, the city a chronicle remembered and science forgot. The problem was not that the city was lost. The problem was that it had never truly been forgotten, not by the people who kept the records. For roughly 7 centuries, a medieval Cambodian royal chronicle named Mahendra Parvata as the first capital of the Khmer Kingdom, a city of streets and temples raised on the plateau of Phnom Kulen in what is now northwestern Cambodia. Historians read that chronicle. They noted it. Then they set it aside, because no Western survey had confirmed what the words described. In 2015, a team of researchers from the University of Toulouse changed that. Working with airborne LiDAR equipment mounted above the dense canopy of Phnom Kulen Mountain, the team swept pulses of laser light down through the treetops and read what the ground sent back. The jungle had hidden it completely. Beneath the canopy lay a planned 9th century city, a grid of streets, the foundations of temples, the geometric logic of an organized urban center. The city was real. It had always been real. The staggering number is this: Mahendra Parvata predates Angkor Wat by at least 200 years. The monument the world knows, photographed on every travel poster, listed on every heritage register, was not the beginning. It was a continuation. The civilization that built Angkor Wat had already been building, planning, and governing for 2 centuries before the first stone of that famous complex was placed. And this is where the timeline stops making sense. The LiDAR map did not reveal a primitive settlement that happened to grow into something grander. It revealed a city with deliberate infrastructure, oriented streets, and a spatial logic that implies administrators, surveyors, and a functioning state apparatus operating in the 9th century on a mountain plateau that modern archaeology had simply declined to look at closely. The Chronicle had described exactly this. The instruments finally agreed. This means several things, stated plainly. First, the conventional archaeological habit of treating Angkor Wat as the origin point of mature Khmer urban planning must be revised. Second, the written testimony of a living culture, maintained across centuries by people with direct cultural investment in its accuracy, was treated as legend until a laser scanner endorsed it. Mainstream archaeologists dispute the full extent of Mahendra Parvata's urban area as mapped by LiDAR, and some argue that portions of the identified grid may reflect natural or later formations rather than 9th century construction, so that one claim remains contested. But the core finding, that a planned urban settlement existed on Phnom Kulen before Angkor, is now accepted. The pattern here is not unique to Cambodia. In 2018, researchers from Silpakorn University used LiDAR to survey the ancient Thai city of Sukhothai and found an outer ring of reservoirs and canals extending 12 kilometers beyond the boundary of the UNESCO-mapped heritage zone. The city that the heritage maps described was a fraction of the city that actually existed. A year later, in 2019, researcher Diane Davis and colleagues used similar survey methods in the Basin of Mexico to show that Teotihuacan's influence on regional settlement reached satellite communities up to 50 kilometers from the city's core. In each case, the instrument expanded the boundary. In each case, the written or physical record had hinted at the larger scale. In each case, the larger scale had weighted. The truly unsettling aspect is what this reveals about whose testimony gets treated as evidence. The Cambodian Chronicle was not an anonymous rumor. It was a maintained, named, culturally continuous record of a people describing their own history. It was discounted for 700 years. A machine flew over the jungle for a single season, and the question was considered settled. Mahendra Parvata is still there, still mostly unexcavated, still covered in large part by the canopy that hid it. Archaeologists have cleared paths to certain temple foundations, but the full grid of streets has never been walked systematically, never been mapped at ground level with the same care that was given to Angkor. The chronicle that described this city still exists too in the same libraries where it was read and set aside. What remains unresolved is not the city's location. What remains unresolved is the question of how many other chronicles, in how many other languages, are sitting in how many other libraries right now, describing places that laser light has not yet been asked to confirm. Deeper into the Americas, a different kind of record has survived. Not in writing, not in stone grids, but in the soil itself, where hundreds of kilometers of raised fields and canals fed a civilization so vast that its agriculture reshaped the landscape of an entire continent. Number 3. Bolivian Amazon cities, and the forest kept the secret well. The mystery had been sitting in plain sight for more than 2 centuries. In 1786, a Spanish Jesuit priest named Lázaro de Ribera was traveling through the Llanos de Mojos, a vast, seasonally flooded savanna in what is now northern Bolivia, when local Moxos people described to him an intricate ancient landscape of earthen mounds, raised fields, and engineered waterways stretching across the plain. De Ribera wrote it down. He submitted his account. And then, for 236 years, mainstream archaeology looked elsewhere. The ground itself held what the written record could not make credible. In 2022, a LiDAR survey over the Bolivian Amazon, led by researchers including José Iriarte of the University of Exeter, swept laser pulses through the forest canopy and returned an image of a world that had been invisible to every satellite and every ground expedition that came before it. The survey revealed over 20 settlement sites in the Llanos de Mojos region alone, each with raised agricultural fields, irrigation canals, and elevated causeways connecting them in straight lines across the floodplain. These were not scattered homesteads. The Casarabe culture, the people who built this system, had constructed a low-density urban network with civic and ceremonial centers at its core, covering at least 4,500 square kilometers. Let that number land. 4,500 square kilometers of engineered, inhabited, administered landscape hidden beneath the canopy of one of the least surveyed places on Earth. The textbook account of pre-Columbian Amazonia had long described it as a region of small, mobile, forest-adapted communities. The prevailing view held that the rainforest environment simply could not sustain large, settled, complex societies, that the poor tropical soils made dense populations impossible. This was not a fringe position. It was the consensus that shaped a century of research priorities, funding decisions, and ultimately which observers were taken seriously and which were not. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The LiDAR data did not merely complicate the consensus, it dismantled the premise on which the consensus rested. The Casarabe people did not simply live in the landscape. They engineered it at a continental scale, building infrastructure that managed water, moved people, and sustained urban life across terrain that mainstream archaeology had classified as fundamentally hostile to exactly that kind of civilization. And the 2019 LiDAR study published in Nature Plants added another dimension entirely, revealing that ancient Amazonian peoples had deliberately cultivated 85 domesticated tree species that still dominate large sections of Amazonian forest today. The forest itself is, in part, an artifact. The wilderness is managed. The wilderness always was. This means several things that do not sit comfortably together. It means the Amazon was not a barrier to civilization, but a medium for it, shaped by human hands across millennia. It means the low-density urban model of the Casarabe culture represents a form of city that archaeologists were not looking for, and therefore did not find, even when the evidence was underfoot. It means de Ribera's account, the Jesuits' careful 1786 record of what the Moxos people told him, was accurate. The mainstream disputed this, it is fair to say, in part simply because the person reporting it was not the kind of observer the institution trusted. The problem is not that de Ribera was wrong. The problem is that the apparatus for evaluating his account was designed to discount it, and the laser confirmed it anyway. What makes this particularly haunting is that the delay was not caused by a lack of evidence. The testimony existed. The earthworks were visible to anyone standing on them. The 85 cultivated tree species were growing in full view across the basin. What was missing was not data. What was missing was institutional willingness to treat certain witnesses as credible sources of information about their own landscape and their own past. The Llanos de Mojos is still there, still only partially surveyed, its full extent still unmapped beneath canopy that LiDAR has not yet reached. The causeways built by the Casarabe culture are still running in straight lines between centers that archaeologists have barely begun to excavate, carrying the geometry of a planning tradition that no one has yet fully described. The question of how many other vast, engineered, populated landscapes are waiting beneath other forest canopies, not just in Amazonia, but across the humid tropics where survey is sparse and colonial-era testimony was routinely discarded, remains entirely unanswered. Somewhere beneath a different kind of obscuring layer, in a Pacific archipelago rather than a forest, a monument stands that is not supposed to exist at the depth where divers first found it. And the argument over who built it and when has been running for decades without resolution. Number 2. Anuradhapura's hinterland, where the map was wrong all along. The mystery was not buried. It was working. In 2018, a research team deploying LiDAR technology over the dry zone of Sri Lanka was systematically scanning the forest and scrubland surrounding the ancient capital of Anuradhapura, when the data began returning something the textbooks had never suggested. The pulses of laser light passed through the canopy and bounced back from the ground below, and what they revealed was not a city with a modest agricultural fringe. It was a continuous urban and hydraulic landscape stretching across roughly 4,500 square kilometers, an area larger than the island of Cyprus, and almost none of it had been formally mapped by outside scholarship. 4,500 square kilometers. Let that land. The LiDAR imagery traced the outlines of roads, settlement platforms, monastic complexes, and, most strikingly, an intricate web of reservoirs and canals connecting them, the structure known to Sri Lankan engineers as the cascade system, in which each tank feeds the next downhill, regulating water across a vast catchment with extraordinary precision. The physical evidence was not fragmentary. It was dense, coherent, and enormous in scale, suggesting a planned hydraulic civilization whose footprint dwarfed what aerial photographs or ground survey had ever captured. Before 2018, the academic consensus placed Anuradhapura at the center of a powerful but essentially compact ancient kingdom. The city itself was well documented, its dagobas among the largest brick structures ever built in the ancient world. But the surrounding landscape was read as rural, secondary, sparsely organized, a supporting hinterland rather than an integrated metropolitan system. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The cascade irrigation system had not, in fact, been forgotten. Local irrigation engineers and farming communities across the dry zone had been maintaining sections of it in working condition for centuries, passing the practical knowledge of water management from generation to generation through use rather than through text or monument. Mainstream archaeology, focused on ruins and inscriptions, had simply not recognized a living technical tradition as archaeological evidence. The knowledge was not lost. It was hiding in plain sight, embedded in daily labor, in the angle of a bund, in the placement of a sluice gate, in the seasonal decisions of farmers who never stopped working the system their ancestors had built. This means the scale of Anuradhapura's civilization was not rediscovered in 2018 so much as it was finally seen by people who had not known to look. The LiDAR survey confirmed what local practice had preserved, that the ancient city was not a node surrounded by countryside, but the administrative heart of a hydraulic network whose engineering logic had remained functionally continuous across more than a millennium. It means the assumption that urban sophistication disappears when monuments' decay is demonstrably incomplete, because continuity of knowledge can survive in gesture and habit and irrigation schedule long after the stone has been swallowed by scrub. The 2018 data also illuminated something relevant far beyond Sri Lanka. That same year, a team led by researcher Thomas Garrison conducted LiDAR surveys over Tikal in Guatemala, and found that a feature long mapped as a natural hill was in fact a massive pyramid beneath jungle cover, and that an entire unknown citadel nearby mirrored the layout of Teotihuacan in central Mexico cities, separated by more than 1,000 kilometers, implying networks of political and ritual influence that no ground survey had ever suggested. 2 surveys, 2 continents, 1 year. Both rewrote the scale of what was there. What makes this particularly haunting is that the Anuradhapura discovery forces a specific and uncomfortable question about methodology rather than antiquity. Scholars were not looking in the wrong place. They were looking with the wrong assumptions. searching for ruins as the signature of civilization and failing to read a living system as evidence of the same thing. The Cascade Network is still there. Farmers are still maintaining sections of it as they have for centuries in the dry zone of Sri Lanka, with no need for academic confirmation of what their hands already know. The full extent of what was built, who coordinated it at its height, and how a hydraulic system of that scale was administered across 4,500 square kilometers remains, in its deepest detail, unanswered. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, at the very edge of the medieval world, a settlement was built in a place Europeans were not supposed to reach for another 5 centuries. And a single iron nail has become the most argued over piece of metal in the history of exploration. Number 1, the hidden civilization mosaic, and the forest kept every secret. The mystery was never whether ancient civilizations were sophisticated. The question was how many of them we had simply failed to see. For centuries, the answer seemed obvious. Archaeologists had walked the ground, mapped the ruins, catalogued the stones. The picture felt reasonably complete. It was not. In 2015, Honduran archaeologist Oscar Neil Cruz and his colleagues flew a LiDAR-equipped aircraft over the Mosquitia rainforest in eastern Honduras, a region so dense and so remote that ground surveys had barely scratched its outermost edges. Mosquitia had carried a legend for centuries. Honduran oral tradition described a lost city deep in that green interior, a place known as the City of the Jaguar God, a settlement swallowed whole by the jungle and preserved only in spoken memory, passed from generation to generation. Cruz and his colleagues were there to test whether any physical truth survived beneath that canopy. The instrument they carried fired millions of laser pulses downward through the tree cover, measured the time each pulse took to return, and assembled from those measurements a precise terrain map of everything the forest had been hiding. What came back onto their screens was not a ruin field. It was a city. Earthen mounds rose in deliberate formation. Open plazas stretched between them. The geometry of the layout spoke of planning, of a society that had organized space with intention and maintained that organization across generations, and whose construction required labor coordinated on a scale that only a functioning civilization could sustain. More striking still was what sat undisturbed at the site's center. A single cache held more than 500 artifacts, still resting precisely where ancient hands had placed them, arranged in a configuration that researchers interpreted not as the scattered remnants of a city abandoned in crisis, but as the product of deliberate ritual deposition objects left with purpose, in position as a final act of ceremony rather than an act of flight. 500 objects, still there, still in situ. That concentration alone would have warranted years of careful study. But the Mosquitia discovery was not an isolated event. It was a signal, and other signals were already gathering. In 2020, researchers turned LiDAR onto Montenegro, an ancient Oaxacan city in Mexico whose occupation during the Monte Alban I phase had placed it firmly within the archaeological literature for decades. Ground surveys had produced maps, and those maps had guided interpretation. They had also, it emerged, missed a considerable portion of the city's true layout. The LiDAR survey returned an urban plan far more complex than any previous ground-based effort had captured. Roads connecting platforms, spatial arrangements that indicated distinct functional zones, and an overall organization that transformed the understood scale of the site in a single survey pass. Researchers had walked Montenegro. They had mapped it by hand and by older instruments. LiDAR looked once from above, and the city that came back was larger and more deliberate than the city the textbooks had described. The standard explanation for gaps in the ancient record had always rested on time. Civilizations decay, materials erode, organic matter vanishes. The absences in the map, the reasoning went, were absences in history itself. Places where human activity had simply not left a durable enough trace to survive. What LiDAR is demonstrating, site by site, is that this explanation was wrong in its foundation. The gaps are not in the past. They are in the instruments that were used to examine it. In 2023, researchers from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, known as INAH, conducted a LiDAR survey near San Lorenzo in Veracruz. Olmec territory, one of the most extensively studied archaeological regions anywhere in the Americas, a landscape that specialists had examined across more than half a century of sustained fieldwork. Within that landscape, the survey identified a previously undocumented ceremonial complex of significant scale, an Olmec-era construction predating 1200 BCE that had generated no entry in the existing record, because no one had yet looked at that ground from above with the right instrument. Mainstream archaeology accepts the INAH findings as credible, though the full interpretation of the complex's function and its relationship to the broader San Lorenzo sphere remains under active investigation. That qualifier, predating 1200 BCE, carries considerable weight in a region that specialists had considered thoroughly mapped. It was not thoroughly mapped. It was thoroughly walked. The pattern extends far beyond the Americas. In 2019, the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project combined LiDAR with ground-penetrating radar across a 12-square-kilometer study area surrounding Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England, ground that has been examined, theorized over, and written about for more than 2 centuries, ground that carries more accumulated scholarly attention than almost any comparable landscape on Earth. Within that single surveyed zone, the project identified at least 17 previously unknown ritual monuments, buried intact beneath fields that millions of visitors had crossed without any awareness of what lay beneath their feet. 17 monuments, 12 square kilometers, one study. The sheer density of what had gone unrecorded in a landscape that archaeology had treated as its most familiar territory reframed every assumption about completeness. What makes each of these cases quietly unsettling is that none of them involved unexplored wilderness. Mosquitia was legendary, but the others, Monte Negro, San Lorenzo, Stonehenge's surrounding plain, were studied ground. They had their chapters, they had their maps. The revision did not come from finding something new in unknown territory. It came from finding something vast in territory that was supposed to be known. The scale of ancient civilization is not, then, a figure that scholarship is slowly refining toward a final answer. It is an open measurement with no confirmed floor, and every LiDAR flight over unscanned ground represents the first honest reading of a room that was always there. Every canopy is an archive. Every unflown valley holds its geometry intact patient beneath whatever growth has claimed the surface. The artifacts at Mosquitia are still resting exactly where ancient hands placed them, in position, in silence, in a city that oral tradition remembered long after every instrument of the time had failed to find it. How many other traditions are still waiting for the instrument that will finally confirm what they have always said was there? That question has no answer yet. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.